Hello, my name is Dr. Cheryl Burdette, and I'm the co-founder and educational director for Precision Point Diagnostics. Today we're going to examine the P88 Dietary Antigen Test. I'm very excited to talk to you about this test because I think it gets to the heart of what patients want to know. When they're working towards wellness or when they've been diagnosed with a chronic condition, they come to us looking for information, and one of the foundational things that they're curious about is, hey doc, what can I eat? What can I do to help this to be better? And so we will think about that and look to the data and maybe think about a Mediterranean diet or a low histamine diet or a diet that's low in carbohydrates, maybe just trying to get them to eat more vegetables. But how do we know that it's right for them? It's a complicated question. What should I eat? When should I eat it? How much? However, there's a way to simply address this. The P88 Dietary Antigen Test is going to show you 4 different ways your body reacts to foods. Not only are we going to look at all of the immune pathways that are important in food reactions, but we're going to arm you with diets. We're going to let you know which foods are the worst, which ones are the best. We're going to tell you the food families that are important for your patient, as well as other groupings like histamine or oxalates that might come into play as well. It's the only test that combines all of this information so you can really definitively the answer of, hey, what should I eat? So let's take a deep dive into the P88 Dietary Antigen Test. We're going to look at these multiple ways your patient reacts to food. We're going to walk through the complexities and the nuances so you really understand what you're looking at. But then we're going to take it a step further and show you how we're able to simplify it so the message is still easily conveyed to the patient. Anytime there's complexity and multiple ways that you look at something, it can seem daunting, maybe not to you, but especially the patient. So if we have that next piece that really helps them to boil it down to what's most important for them, that makes for a meaningful test result. So let's dig in. When we first begin to look at the test results, what we'll see is something referred to as IgE, and this is what you're very familiar with. IgE are your standard allergic reactions. And so this is that you eat a food and your lips swell or there's shortness of breath. You might even have to go to a hospital. You carry an EpiPen. It can be a life-threatening event. And so we start there. And so as I mentioned, as the Journal of Immunology says, when you have a symptom to food, IgE is only positive 50% of the time. So we know there's 50% to the rest of the story, and so by adding the other immune markers of how the body reacts, we can capture 100%. So here's IgE, and it's going to show that immediate reactivity. However, when we talk to patients, we've all had the patient who says, yeah, I had a dairy allergy, I was allergic to milk as a child, but I grew out of it. And we're often left thinking, is that true? Is that accurate? Is it possible? And absolutely it's possible. That is the second piece that's measured on the Precision Allergy 88, which is the IgG4. IgG4 is part of the immunoglobulin class IgG, but there are 4 subclasses of IgG, subclass 1, 2, 3, and 4. And IgG4 is distinct from the others in the family. And in fact, many will say this is a problem with measuring IgG. When you look at all of it together, you're looking at multiple things that react in different ways, not getting a clear picture. That is true. That's why we tease it out and look at it independently. So IgG4 is its own unique antibody. It acts very differently than type 1, 2, and 3. Type 1, 2, and 3 bind to, complement, and amplify the reaction. But IgG4 does its own thing. IgG4 is a much smaller antibody with different reaction. It doesn't bind to complement. It doesn't create a lot of inflammation, but it can slot into the IgE receptor and block IgE from binding. When you block IgE from binding, you don't get degranulation of a mast cell that releases histamine. You prevent that from occurring. And this is a very known mechanism of action. In fact, anyone who engages in desensitization is utilizing this mechanism. When we do injections or sublingual immunotherapy, drops of antigen under the tongue, the whole intent of that therapy is not to decrease IgE IgE that causes an allergic reaction, but to increase this IgG4. And when you increase IgG4, you block IgE, preventing the allergic reaction. And so as IgG4 goes up, you create immune tolerance. And that is indicated in this column that shows whether or not the patient is still allergic to the food. With other testing, you could see IgE and think that there's a problem, but if IgG4 is greater than IgE, it's blunting that response. We're the only test that looks at both, are you allergic, and have you developed tolerance to that allergy, creating immune tolerance. So when IgG4 is greater than IgE, that will be reflected as a yes in this column, showing that in fact, even though that they have an IgE titer, these aren't foods that you have to worry about. You can keep them in the diet, and you can let the patient know that in fact, these are no longer problematic for them. In addition to that, if you're doing desensitization therapy in your office, now you'll be able to see when they have developed a level of IgG4 that blocks IgE and keeps them from having allergic reactions. This may seem curious to you at first because it's not talked about a lot, which is unfortunate because, like I said, it's a very well developed and known mechanism of action in the literature. And when we think about it, we would not be a very successful species if in fact food often killed us. If you ate a strawberry and you died from that, it wouldn't be too much in our favor. What we want is to receive nutrition from foods that we eat, so the body is wise. It develops compensatory mechanisms, things like IgG4, to help us overcome allergies that we might have. So we look at allergies, we look at whether or not you become desensitized to those allergies, that's IgG4, indicated by a level of immune tolerance, and then we look at sensitivities. Sensitivities are driven by IgG 1, 2, and 3, and IgG 1 and 3 are most predominant. Again, these are different than IgG subtype 4. They do bind to complement, they do create inflammation, however, not an immediate reaction. IgG sensitivities create a reaction in the body 3 to 72 hours after exposure. And so this can be very difficult to figure out just from a history alone. It can lead to a lot of patient confusion. They're having a terrible headache that day and they say, well, what did I have for breakfast this morning? And it's actually what they had for breakfast 2 or 3 days ago. And so you can see how it becomes difficult to tease out without testing that leads the patient in the right direction. So we measure IgG, but again, we know that it too does not work in isolation. IgG also works in hand with complement. Complement modulates its function, and when complement binds to IgG, it creates a reaction 1,000 to 10,000-fold greater than just that IgG alone. Many tests out there look at only IgG, this singular reaction. And when practitioners have utilized this style of testing, they're left saying, I don't know, it doesn't seem to mirror exactly what's going on in the patient. They'll have moderate levels of reactions on paper, but then they'll tell you, well, this is the one that I react the most to. This is the one that always triggers my headache, yet this other IgG titer that's high, I don't really have as much difficulty with that. So how can we understand that? Well, if IgG is present with complement, when they bind together, there's an amplification of that reaction. So if you're not measuring complement, you're missing a large part of that story. Now, when complement is only positive and IgG is not positive, it doesn't have nearly as much function in the body. So if you're looking at reactions in this column, if you're looking at reactions in terms of complement, you're not as worried about those unless IgG is also positive. The two together is really when it's most problematic. Let's say that you see a lot of complement reactions that are positive, but not a lot of IgG. You might not take those foods out, but we can think, okay, what calms down complement? What calms down this part of the immune system? And a couple of things that are known to downregulate that branch of the immune system are curcuminoids that are found in things like turmeric or omega-3 fatty acids. So it alerts you to the fact that there's some low-level inflammation occurring, that there's a part of the immune system that's overly reactive, and it guides us clinically in terms of next steps. So when we look at IgE, IgE, an allergic reaction, IgG4 that can blunt that allergic reaction, IgG, sensitivities, and complement, we get a much more detailed picture of exactly which things are going to be most symptomatic for your patient. So now we've walked through 4 independent ways that the body can react to foods, and with that comes complexity. And with complexity, there can be confusion, especially for your patient who's saying, wait, but this column says I'm reactive and this column says I'm not reactive. How do I reconcile those things? But also with complexity comes better understanding. An equivalent would be to say, well, we would never want to move beyond just looking at cholesterol because that's simple. Whereas now we look at cholesterol, HDL, LDL, triglycerides. Of course, there's complexity to that, but it helps us to understand the patient better. The same is true here. Unless we're looking at multiple ways the patient reacts to foods, we can't understand the entire picture. However, that can be difficult in a patient setting, and it ultimately has no meaning if we can't communicate effectively what it all means. So after that, you'll turn to the 3rd page of the test, and what you'll see are diets. This breaks it down in a very simple way for the patient, and the first one is called the less restrictive diet. So what we do is we take and we make a list of the foods that your patient was high to, the ones that were either high in terms of allergies that were not blocked or sensitivities. Then we have them rotate the moderate sensitivities that also have complement present. Why? Because those are the ones that are more inflammatory. And then they leave in the foods that have no reaction to them. So the patient has a simple piece of paper that says, eat this, don't eat this. A little piece of advice when you're sharing this with a patient, don't start with the column that says, these are the things you cannot eat. We get caught up in that and overly focused on it. So instead, fold the piece of paper in half and show them, here are all the foods that you can eat. Are there things on this list that you like, that you eat often? Get that buy-in. And then as they say yes to that, it's not quite the same news when they see the column of the things they can't eat. Then, as soon as anyone sees a list of foods they can't eat, the next question is, but when can I have them again? And for some foods, rarely, the answer is going to be, well, we'd like that to be never to almost never. Foods that fall into that category are often wheat or gluten-containing foods or casein, dairy with casein in it. Those are the things that tend to be the most reactive in the body. Outside of that, encourage your patient. Let them know that the reason for food elimination is not to make their diet smaller, but ultimately to be able to open up their diet in a more robust way, but without having reactions. So then the question is, well, how long will I need to remove these foods from my diet? And of course that varies from patient to patient, but some general guidelines are for someone who is less symptomatic, maybe moderate level of fatigue, but not very aggressive, not a chronic condition that's progressing rapidly, we're going to guide them that probably 3 to 6 months is the amount of time to take these foods out. For somebody who's more severe, a chronic pathology that they suffered for many years, rapidly advancing, low quality of life, not feeling like themselves, then we're probably going to give them the guidance that they need to remove these foods for at least 9 months. And I know that that sounds like a long period of time, but we're removing these foods so that we can retrain the immune system. And when you eliminate them for 9 months, that gives that window for the immune system to quit being reactive to things it shouldn't, for the gut lining to heal, for the immune system to calm back down again. When we compare that to desensitization therapies, injections, or drops under the tongue, we know that a patient will often do that for 2 to 3 years. So retraining your immune system is not something that is immediate or overnight. However, let the patient know that they will start to feel better much more quickly than that. For some people, a few days, others a matter of weeks, but in a more short period of time, they're going to begin to reap the benefits. They're going to hold on to that diet for a longer period of time so they can fully retrain their immune system and then reintroduce these foods, keep them in a diet, and still have high quality of life. The idea is not that we're taking things away forever, but we're taking them away so the immune system can calm down, so they can be reintroduced, and an increase in normalcy gained around foods that we eat. The next diet is the more restrictive diet, and as you can guess from the name, more foods are taken out. Here, instead of eliminating just the high levels of reactivity, we take out both the moderates and the high. Now, how would you choose between these diets? There's a couple of ways. First, you might be more clinically. If somebody has a greater pathology, if they're feeling more sick, if they have been battling something for years and years, this is going to be a time when we jump in with a more restrictive diet to shut down inflammation as drastically and as quickly as possible. However, even in those people that have a very chronic condition, we will run into patients who have never made dietary changes before, who have consistently gone through the fast food or just eating crackers out of a box and have never really approached a vegetable or a pot or a pan that you might put that in. So even though they are more sick, we have to meet the patient where they are at. In that case, you still might choose the less restrictive diet to help somebody get used to something and transition in. And in fact, you don't have to use just one or the other. You may transition back and forth. We might counsel a patient when you're doing poorly, you're not feeling your best, that's the time to tighten up, go to the more restrictive diet. Now, as you're feeling better, you can weave back and forth to that less restrictive diet, still keeping out those foods you're most reactive to so the immune system gets the opportunity to calm down. The food test gives us a lot of information, but that information is less valuable if it's something unrealistic that a patient can't achieve. That's why we include multiple diets so you can work with the patient where they're at, meet them where they're at clinically, but also meet them where they're at mentally, emotionally about those relationships and attachments to food that we all have. After the diets, you're going to find something called the immune index. And this is a proprietary formula, patent pending, that we have developed that took all the classes of antibodies, created a calculation around that, weighted based on level of inflammation, subtracted based on things that detract from the reaction, and came up with a list from top to bottom. Most reactive to least reactive. Very simple. So now there aren't multiple columns. Now there aren't multiple ways that you're reacting. There's just the foods, the worst to the best. And so this can come in useful for a number of different reasons. Let's say your patient is highly compromised and you get the test back and it turns out that they are reactive to majority of foods on there. This doesn't occur often, but there are a handful of times where you will see this. And you're left saying, these foods create inflammation, but I need you to have something in your diet. Ultimately, it's not healthy to eat nothing. So we might turn to this page, the immune index, and say, you know what? I want you to just focus on the top 10. Let's be conscientious about those, and this way we can still make sure you're getting the nutrition in the diet you need. Or how about this? The patient comes in and they tell you afterwards, oh no, I took an anti-inflammatory that day, or I took some type of medication that I now realize might have affected the results. And in that case, you might just decide to do a redraw, but you could still say, okay, that would suppress all of your immune system, so everything gets shifted to the left, but what's still the highest is the highest. So let's still take out the highest level of foods that are reacting here. This gives you a gauge to help to see what the patient is most reactive, least reactive to, and really meet them where they're at. Maybe they say, I'm very much struggling with this and I've never changed my diet before. Okay, this week I want you to take out the top 3 foods. Next week, we're going to work on 5 foods, and so on and so forth, so that you can gradually work them into this space of dietary change that can be foreign and off-putting for people that have never done something like this before. Next, we break the foods down into categories based on compounds that are present. These are not allergic reactions. These are not sensitivities, but these are groupings of where foods tend to light up. So we know there are all kinds of diets out there. For example, there's a low oxalate diet that's often recommended for people that might form kidney stones. A low glutamine diet that might be utilized for people that are more neurologically compromised, something like traumatic brain injury or when somebody's experiencing more anxiety. A low lectin diet. Some people can be reactive to proteins that are on the outside of vegetables, and even those can give them difficulty. So we take these various dietary approaches that are out there, and if you reacted to a food that is in one of those categories, we alert you to that. So now you can go back and say, aha, you have this pattern of having lots of reactions within the lectin column. Okay, so in addition to the foods that you're sensitive to, let's also put you on a low lectin diet. Aha, you're having lots of reactions to these foods that are high in histamine. So let's remove the foods that you react to, but let's also put you on a low histamine diet. It's one more way to see patterns that are occurring to help to alert you to other things that might be going on that are creating disruptions because of foods, but aren't strictly allergies or sensitivities. Then we continue to drill down and look at not only those allergic reactions, but what families were those foods in. And so we'll show you the families that you're most reactive to. Were you most reactive to the grain family? Were you most reactive to the fungus family? Now, in fairness, there are things on here like the vegetable family, and I will confess I've probably never let a patient get away with being on a low vegetable diet. However, some of this can be quite useful. So let's say they had a lot of reactivity to wheat and barley and rye, and you remove those things and they feel better, but not 100%. You might then look to this page and say, okay, the family where you're most reactive is the grain family, so now we're also going to remove the diet from multiple grains to see if we continue to get improvement. The other one that I find very clinically useful is the fungus family. And so this is a calculation done around foods that are in the fungus family, such as mushrooms, but also candida. For me, my approach is first to remove the things that the person is reactive to. Then evaluate the clinical response. If it's not where I would expect it to be, then to look at these families and make further removal. That's particularly useful for a yeast diet or a mold diet, because if you start off trying to remove everything that's moldy, that can be quite exhaustive to the patient and maybe not even necessary. When you are working with these food families and looking for direction, please refer to our physician guide. In there we detail what would a candida diet look like, what would a mold diet look like, what would a low histamine diet look like. We also detail food families and cross-reactivity. So for example, you could see that a patient has a sensitivity to clam, and then they tell you, "Ugh, I hate clams, I never eat that. Why would this come back positive?" Well, it turns out there's cross-reactivity between clam and the environmental allergy cockroach. So we give you a list of not only food families and cross-reactivity, but also cross-reactivity between foods and things in the environment. Bananas and the latex family. So someone who's sensitive to bananas might have a problem with latex. If somebody comes back with a sensitivity or an allergy to beef and they tell you, "I'm vegetarian, I don't know how I could have a reaction," well, there's a cross-reactivity with tick bites. And so by looking at some of these cross-reactivities, we're able to learn even more than just what this food alone is telling us. Another nuance of the test is some of the things measured aren't directly foods. Candida is certainly not a food. It's a yeast, and we would not imagine a patient sitting down to a plate of candida. So why is it here? The reason it's here is because it will amplify food reactions, particularly sensitivities. If your immune system is reacting to candida, the likelihood is that you have candida. And this yeast will chew up the local immune lining in our gut, secretory IgA. And as it chews up that secretory IgA, as that first line defense is worn down, the rest of the immune system becomes more reactive. Think of it as soldiers fighting. If your front line is failing, then your back line says, I better be more reactive, I better man open up and be more aggressive. So if there's candida, it will lower secretory IgA, your first line defense, and your titers to foods, your IgE titer, your IgG titer will go up higher and will continue to stay up even with the removal of food. So we feel it's important to include this because we don't want your patient in that situation of removing foods, retesting, seeing the titers still elevated, and becoming upset with that and frustrated. They've done the right things, but they're not seeing the outcome they would expect. Another culprit in that category is Aspergillus. That's mold. And while it's true, we don't know if they're getting that from moldy foods or from the environment, it is one of those things that will still amplify reactivity to other things in the fungus family, and so having an understanding of it being there is helpful. Like I said, the Aspergillus falls into the mold family, and the physician guides will give you diet around that. The P88 Dietary Antigen Test is a complete picture of the biochemistry of how we react to foods, but then we break it down for you in a more restrictive and a less restrictive diet, giving you multiple tools to meet the patient where they're at. We further hone in with the immune index, listing worst foods to best foods, so you can draw a bright line and eliminate exactly what fits the patient. We look at those groupings, those food categories, and food families. With all of these lenses, we can put together the best picture. We can put together the optimal diet that meets that patient where they're at.